their observations was that we didn't have a concentration of tech startups and innovation companies in Auckland, and that if we were going to sort of do, if we were going to lead the way in things other than our primary industries in New Zealand, that it was really to our benefit to have such a kind of concentration here in Auckland. And so they chose Wainuku for the location and put 18 in charge of developing this community. And this is kind of this is sort of part one of the community. So this building, which is home to about 100 of us, is the first building in the community. There's a new building which is in the process of being opened at the moment over the other side of the block here, and eventually this block is going to be sort of filled with buildings that are part of the group community. And the idea is that you can come in here on day one as a kind of just a person with an idea and a laptop and nothing else, and sit in the tech cafe and use the free Wi-Fi and drink water and order some coffees and work from there. Then you might move upstairs and take a hot desk for a day a week, and then maybe 2 days a week, and then 5 days a week, and then move to an actual fixed desk, and then be a pod of people, and then be then eventually kind of the ability is to become a company of 100 people with an entire floor in one of the other buildings. And through that whole kind of process of going from literally a blank piece of paper right through to a large company, you can go through that whole process within this community, supported by the kind of the support network that's within Grid AKL. So it's a pretty amazing vision, and it's a pretty cool thing to be a part of. Grid AKL and my company, Previously Unavailable, were born on the same day 3.5 years ago, and so we've been residents here right from the start. So yeah, firstly, welcome to this kind of special and exciting and interesting place. So I run a company called Previously Unavailable. We are more or less a kind of ventures company. So we create new products and we create new startup companies, sometimes for ourselves and sometimes in partnership with larger organisations or other startups. Hey.
We're just giving you a mic because the drilling outside might override your talking.
Okay. Cool. I'm happy with that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, the sounds, this place is also filled with the sounds of progress. All the time. It's a bit unnerving when sometimes they'll drop like a enormous bit of building that they've just kind of wedged off, and this whole thing kind of shakes. So if that happens, don't worry, it's not an earthquake. Is this still working? Have you turned the screen off?
Was it working before?
It was, yeah. So I want to talk to you a little bit, I guess, about our observations on innovation, some of the challenges that we kind of see, and I guess some of the things that we think are the answer to overcoming some of those challenges. Innovation's kind of, never have we had so much interest in innovation. Never as a business community have we prioritised innovation, have we spent so much time kind of talking about innovation and strategising and ideating and all of that good stuff. This is one of my favourite New Yorker cartoons. And it makes me laugh because innovation really has become so ubiquitous, kind of interest in innovation, which I think is a great thing. But also, when you think about it, what that interest is sort of turning into. We did a survey last year of CEOs. When you ask them how important they consider innovation, 60% of them say 10 out of 10 in terms of importance. Most of them say 8 or higher. The average is 8.9. So we all understand the importance of innovation. Everyone's talking innovation. But if you think about the larger organisations in New Zealand, there are 2,300 companies of over 100 people in New Zealand, and the amount of new innovations that stand out in your mind as having come out of those companies in the last couple of years. Generally when I ask people that question, they kind of struggle to think of too many examples. certainly not 2,300, but almost all of those companies would have had the ideation day and the innovation workshop and the big strategy day at the start of the year and all of that kind of stuff. But what kind of emerges from that is often, not quite as much as what we'd hoped. And so this is kind of reflected in the data. So the Productivity Commission and Motu Research did a study a couple of years ago now, but they actually found that, indeed, all of our innovation inputs, our R&D, our strategizing and ideation, all that stuff that I've talked about, that's increasing, and it has been increasing hugely over time. But in fact, when we look at our innovation outputs as a community, how many new products we're taking to market, how much of our sales revenue is being drawn from new products and new innovations, in fact, we're going backwards in New Zealand. So that poses something of a challenge in a world where, we really are kind of governed by disruption in our ability to innovate in the world. If we're actually going backwards at a time when we're spending, so much of our time and energies talking about and prioritizing innovation, then kind of something's wrong. And in our view, previously, innovation is only innovation when something actually happens, when there's actually a new product that ends up in a customer's hands. That's the only time that you can call it innovation. Everything before that is not innovation. It's just kind of, it's creativity, or it's inventing things, or whatever, but it's not innovation. I heard someone say once, innovation's the process of turning ideas into invoices, and that's very true. But until you kind of have something out in the world, it isn't innovation. And I think one of the things which I'm going to talk a little bit about today is kind of why we have so much, so much of that innovation talk, but so little of those actual outcomes. We did this study last year, sort of because we became fascinated with, what are the challenges to innovation? Obviously, there are many, and they're often very hard challenges. What are they? How can we sort of start to get over those challenges? And so we went out and talked to CEOs from most of our large organisations in New Zealand, and contrasted that against the views of CEOs from some of our kind of best founder-led startup or founder-led organisations like Xero and Lewis Road Creamery and My Food Bag and Orion Health and Vend, and sort of asking questions about how they define innovation, about how they do innovation, about who's responsible for innovation, about what they've sort of learned along the way about what the challenges are, and what some of the ways of overcoming those challenges are that they've seen. And we produced a report called Big Eye, Little Eye, and it was called Big Eye, Little Eye because one of the things that we found was that there's sort of two types of innovation in larger organisations. There's what we call Little Eye, which is kind of innovating to improve. It's all of the kind of the internal process improvement stuff, sort of doing what we do in a smarter way, in a clever way, in a more creative way. It doesn't necessarily touch the customer, but it does sort of either make for a more efficient process or a kind of happier culture or what have you. And then there's Big Eye innovation, which is launching new things to market, stuff that things that customers end up with in their hands, and both of those things have value. Little Eye innovation has a kind of a bottom line value, an efficiency value. Big Eye innovation aims to grow the top line and make companies kind of bigger and more successful in that way. And so they're both of value, but it's the Big Eye where we're really falling behind. It's the Big Eye where we're going backwards. We're doing lots of the Little Eye stuff, and that's great, and we should be doing that. But it's the Big Eye where we're seeing less success. And I've had lots of people say to me over the years, James, innovation doesn't always have to be, the new big product launch. And that's true, it doesn't. But when it's never that, then we really have a real problem. So part of the objective of the study was to kind of understand what these barriers are to innovation and how we might get over them. So I'm going to show you, I'm going to talk to you about a few things that some of the participants said. This is a really great quote from David McLean from Westpac, and he says, if you're a big organisation like us, a big organisation is like a biological organism, and when a foreign body enters it, it will surround it, and it will either make it look like itself or it will expel it. So the antibodies surround innovation and either absorb it and make it bureaucratized or resist it and kick it out. And that's so kind of, true, and particularly in larger organisations, this kind of these antibodies of innovation. In my time sort of doing this, there's never an idea that's good enough in a large organisation not to have a group of people around it who aren't sure about it, or who think that for various reasons it shouldn't be a priority right now. And that sort of, those antibodies that collect around new ideas, they happen everywhere, and no idea is sort of immune to them. And what we're not very good at doing is kind of anticipating those and planning for them and planning around them and planning for how we're going to get over those. The companies that are really successful innovators, and Air New Zealand's one of our most successful, aren't the companies that have the good ideas. Every single large organisation, all of those CEOs that we talk to, they all talked about having tons of great ideas in their business. They've got strategy out the wazoo, and they've got loads of ideas that they are sure would make a kind of big difference and be hits. It's not a lack of ideas, but it is the companies that are great innovators are the companies that are good at following that process and getting over all of the barriers that stand in the way of innovation and actually getting something out. That's what makes a great innovative organisation. And if you think about something like the Sky Couch, the amount of regulatory hurdles alone that would have been involved in actually getting that thing to market, let alone all of the people within the organisation that might not have thought that it was the best idea. Air New Zealand is an example of a company who's great at anticipating that there will be 100 barriers in the way of any idea, and our job as innovators is not just to have the idea. Our job as innovators is to approach each of those barriers one by one and knock them down and find a way of getting over them and getting the thing out to market. And sometimes those barriers are sort of people who are actively against innovation or against an idea, but more often than not, it's much more passive. They're people who just quietly deprioritise things and say, hey, let's put that off till next week. We've got something to focus on this week. Let's let's take a while to think about that. And that's the death knell usually for any innovation. If innovation's allowed to kind of run out of oxygen, then it will certainly kind of die. And so those kind of, one of the things that I think we need to get better at is anticipating those antibodies and anticipating all of those kind of reasons to say no and barriers, and sort of making a plan for how we're going to get over those before we start. And really commit to the outcome rather than starting the process. So in our experience, where companies have been successful at innovating, where they've actually got something to market, they've made a commitment in the outset to actually get something out the door. They've committed to an outcome. They haven't committed to, let's start an innovation process, let's do a bit of design thinking, let's see where that takes us, and if we spot something, then we'll jump on it and we'll take it out. That almost always ends in nothing happening. And the companies that say we're going to have a new product that's going to be in the market on this date and we're going to commit to that, those are the ones that tend to get things out the door. I grew up in the advertising industry, and in advertising you have a media deadline, right? So no one misses the media deadline because there is a penalty that comes with doing that. You start wasting money really quickly if you miss your media deadline. So you always get the campaign out on time. And that time is always known at the start of the project when the media's been booked for and when we're going to get the thing out the door. And if we didn't have media deadlines, I guarantee you about 10% of the advertising that actually happens would happen. Because it's often kind of, to get a big campaign out the door, it's often a sort of Herculean effort which requires all sorts of people to stay up all night and kind of make sure the damn thing gets out the door on time. And those people that didn't have that deadline, they wouldn't do that. And ad campaigns would run out of oxygen and die the same way innovation does at the moment. At the moment, this is kind of one of the things that we don't have in our community, is that idea of committing to a hard deadline for innovation. Here's a date we're going to have a product in market, and we're not going to miss that date. And so that's one of the things that I think is really kind of critical in terms of getting stuff out the door. Cecilia Robertson from My Food Bag is quite an extraordinary lady, and she talked to us about her culture around innovation. She said our culture around innovation is to say yes. Most people find a reason to say no, and so we find a way of saying yes. And I harp on about that, but so many times we find a way to say no to innovation. When you're taking teams out of corporates, they've been trained for so long to find a reason not to make things work. They become experts at saying no. And so you have to retrain them to actually find a reason to make things work. So we challenge ourselves to find a way to say yes. And it is challenging, that culture of saying yes. The culture of thinking on our feet, continually challenging them. Why can't we do that? If that's what's right for the customer, why can't we do it? If our customers say we want a gluten-free bag, and I go to my operations team, they're like, good luck with that. And I'm like, we're just going to find a way to say yes, right? We're going to get this. And so that's the culture that we drive in our team. And, you know, she is someone that had really kind of spotted that same thing, that there are these antibodies, that there's always a reason to say no to something. And that in the process of sort of creativity or innovation in organisations, you know, you need a whole succession of yeses for something to happen, and you only need one no along the way for it not to. And driving that culture of kind of saying yes and just, you know, really forcing ourselves to turn away from that tendency to kind of say no, which is often the easier thing to say, is one of the reasons why I think my food bag has been so kind of prolific in terms of how it's, you know, not only launched and got to market in greater scale, but, you know, the amount of new things that you see them doing all the time is the mark of a company that has figured out kind of how to say yes and how to, you know, deal with those antibodies in advance. Rod Drury said a really interesting thing to us. He talked to us about consensus and the lack of need for it at Xero. He said, you know, innovation always ends up being designed out or takes too long. So we've learnt not to necessarily get consensus. Give the opportunity for consensus, but don't let it slow the business down. We don't need consensus to make a decision. And this kind of Rod's sentiment sort of usually strikes fear into the hearts of lots of kind of large organisation leaders, because our corporates have grown up really on the basis of consensus-driven decision making. You know, we don't move forward until everyone around the table is in agreement. And that's basically because up until very recently, you know, risk mitigation was the name of the game. And consensus-driven decision-making is a great risk mitigator. It's a fantastic way of eradicating all risk from collective decision-making. But since about 10 or 15 years ago, risk became a really, really essential part of any company's survival. Our ability to innovate rests very heavily on our ability to take risk and manage risk and deal kind of constructively with risk. And if you're managing a company in a way that completely eradicates all risk, then there's no way that you can compete in that world which requires risk-taking and risk management in order to kind of survive. The other thing which we kind of lack or we struggle with in large organisations is pace, speed, how fast we can kind of get to market with new things. Peter Cullinane talked to us about the chocolate milk thing that happened a few years ago now, but was their kind of, you know, a really huge moment in their growth. And he said, where we are good is that we don't take much time on developing stuff. The chocolate milk took 60 contiguous minutes probably. When you're up against bigger competition, the only way you can win is to just be much faster, because they can absolutely beat us on distribution, they can beat us on price, they can beat us on trade merchandising, on trade relationships, on all that sort of stuff, but they can't move at anything like our pace. And so that's cool when you're a startup, but for our larger organisations, you know, often we're competing in a world now not just against the other corporate down the road, but we're competing against the Amazons and the Facebooks and the Googles and these companies, right? And what those companies have figured out how to do is to be very quick. So Amazon's power isn't that they are, you know, they're a great website or they've got great recommendation technology or any of that kind of stuff. It's not that they're a great logistics and supply chain company. Their superpower is that they're fucking fast, right? And every time you look back at them, they've done something new and they've got something new out the door. And that's what makes them a real threat. And as they kind of look to a market entrance in New Zealand, lots of retailers are kind of wondering what they're going to do about Amazon. And my advice to them is just speed up. The thing that they'll do is they'll figure out what your customers want quicker than you will. So if you can figure out what your customers want quicker than them, your customers are going to stick with you. But if you can't, because you're umming and ahhing and sort of, farting around on it, then they'll definitely come and take your customers just through a process of launching new stuff, experimenting with it, figuring out what works, and backing that. Speed's kind of critically important. There's a VC that sits in our pod upstairs with us, and he said to us, when you're developing new products and new innovations, you can do all of your market research, you can do all of your kind of user testing, or of your customer validation and your iteration and all that kind of stuff, and that's fantastic, and you should do that, but the proof is always in the pudding. You're never going to know really, once you get the product out, if anyone's going to buy it. You're never really going to know until you put it out there in the world and you put the buy button next to it and you see if anyone buys it. That's the only time that you're really going to kind of understand that, really know for sure. And so our challenge to ourselves was, okay, if the proof's in the pudding, how do we get to pudding faster? How do we get stuff out into the world in a much quicker, much earlier way, in a way that sort of still manages the risk around that, but actually enables us to understand whether there is proof in the pudding. So we launched this company last year. Play video. And
so this company Toothbrush, this was part of the challenge to ourselves about how do we understand how to get to pudding faster, was how can we create something in the fastest possible time and kind of test ourselves on this kind of idea of getting to pudding fast. So we had the idea for this toothbrush subscription delivery service in September last year, and before that time, believe it or not, we had never imagined ourselves in the toothbrush game. But we kind of saw this really interesting opportunity, because toothbrushes are ubiquitous, right? They're used by everyone every day. The addressable market is like everyone in the world. And kind of no one's ever done anything cool or interesting or fun in toothbrushes. It's like one of the most deadly dull, boring categories ever. And that crossover is always a golden opportunity, right? To do something kind of special. So we had the idea in September. We went and built the business literally from scratch. The supply chain, the manufacturing partnerships, the brand and the marketing and kind of everything. And we launched the business 13 weeks later on December the 7th last year. And so that was kind of our way of sort of seeing, how fast really can we run to get a physical product that looks like a real thing out into the world? How fast and how cheap can we do that? We spent $15,000 in hard costs and 13 weeks in terms of time to get this out into the market. And when we'd done all that, we went through that process. We went through the kind of whole prototyping phase of sort of starting with nothing and getting towards a kind of a toothbrush. We launched what was originally called Freshbrush. So Freshbrush launched on December the 7th. It was a live prototype. We thought of it as a live prototype. So we put this out into the world with a name that we kind of knew that we'd have to change later because we can't trademark it in certain markets. But we just thought we're not going to worry too much about that. We're going to get this out into the world as quick and cheap as possible, and we're going to see if it works. So we got it out. We did a small launch. We did a little bit of social media and a little bit of PR, and we haven't had a day without sales since it launched. We're now running about 5,500 subscribers in New Zealand, and we are launching into Australia this month. So we go global from September, and the hope, again, we're sort of approaching Australia in the same sort of way. How do we get there really quickly, drop the business model down with very little expenditure? How do we test whether that works in Australia, whether we can kind of drop that business model and run it as efficiently as we have in New Zealand and we think we can in Australia? And then if that works, then we'll look at the States and Asia and take it into those much bigger markets, probably within just as sort of short a frame of time as we've done with it in New Zealand. This is the launch that we've done. We didn't launch with kids product, but we've done a kids product now, and this is kind of the launch ad for the kids product.
Who's? There was a t-shirt that said that they were bloody bananas. Also called them. Oh shit. Mama. Oh, Mama thought of them. Because I wouldn't. This is the shit. Just don't tell her, Mum.
So that's the launch of the kids product, and we'll launch that along with the adults product into Australia next month. But I think this is kind of one of the things. I guess our sort of superpower at Previously is being able to kind of do end-to-end entrepreneurialism and very, very rapidly. So we can do everything from the idea at the front and the strategy at the front right through to shooting the ad and sort of making something that looks like something that would come out of an ad agency. And so and the ability to do that very quickly and to really clear away the barriers and get on with it and do that very fast is something that we believe is essential to kind of competing nowadays. There was I don't know if any of you went to the semi-permanent conference the other day, but one of the speakers flashed up a slide that said this, and it really resonated with me. I kind of thought, yeah, that's so true. Speed is the new IP. You can kind of, when we think of IP and sort of protecting things and making sure that we are competitive through protection, like that's okay. But if you can be really fast, then you need less of that. If you're first and you stay first, then that's kind of better than anything. So we've kind of continued down that path of how do we get to pudding faster, and how do we do things even more quickly than we did with toothbrush. This is a project that we've just launched called Citizen, and it's essentially an Uber for babysitters kind of marketplace. So we had an entrepreneur, a woman from here in Auckland, come to us and she said, I've got this kind of idea, I've got this need really, which is babysitters. It's really hard to find one, and it's really hard to find one at the last minute. And that problem is made more complicated by the fact that trust is such a critical thing when you're hiring a babysitter. Finding someone who you trust to leave your children in the hands of is kind of like a deal-breaking kind of thing, right? And she said, the way that we establish trust at the moment is we ask the other parents who have they used, and that's how you sort of establish some degree of trust with a stranger to put them in charge of your kids, right? And how could we develop a digital platform which did that and established that sort of trust relationship? And so we've built this platform called Citizen, and the thing about the innovation here is this trusted by. So for each of the sitters on our platform, you can see who they've been used. The parent has to have used them more than twice, and the parent has to be happy to have their photo on their profile saying, I trust this person. And this is something that we're running in Balmoral. It's just a beta trial. But if you live in Balmoral, you know Charlotte from school, and you know Jane from school, and you know Anna from school. And you might not know them very well, but you see them at school and you know that's that mum, and I kind of know she's not batshit crazy, and she can probably, And so when you kind of do this, and you have sort of sitters you can see who they're trusted by, you can read a personal statement, you can understand all about them. You can get people from, if you ring a babysitting agency or something like that, you've still got in the back of your head, who's going to show up? Are they going to be a psycho? Are they going to be kind of someone that I don't want in my house? I'm not really sure. When you put a platform up like this and you get parents to look at it, they can read about Hannah and they can get to a point where they're 99% sure that Hannah's not a psycho, right? And that trust relationship is kind of, is much more there than it could be through other means. So in terms of Citizen, this was another kind of sprint to see how quickly can we do something like build a whole platform. So this is out in Balmoral, as I said, as a kind of trial. We're running a 3-month trial of a kind of beta version of the platform. It fully works, it's just in a very constrained geographical area. And we went from idea to that platform being up in a month. And, you know, if you know kind of how to use what's available on the internet nowadays in terms of technology that helps you build stuff really quickly, you can build stuff really, really fast, right? And you can throw up something like a platform like this, fully functioning, taking payments, bookings, all the rest of it, and you can do that in a very, very short space of time. And again, this is kind of something that this has cost us not even anywhere near $15,000 like Toothbrush did. This has cost us in the hundreds of dollars to kind of do this. And we can get this out into the world, and now we're playing with it, and we'll play with it over the next 3 months and really understand whether it works and how it works and why it works and what needs changing and what needs developing. And that will put us in a very good position in 3 months' time or 6 months' time when we go and seek investment to do a much bigger platform build, really, really knowing how this product kind of functions. And so that's kind of our, I guess, our belief, you know, is that speed is so critical to innovation, how we can get the blockages out of the way and move really, really quickly to getting stuff out in market so that people can hold it, they can touch it, they can play with it, they can really give us actual feedback on whether it's of value to them and whether they'll buy it and whether they'll interact with it. You know, that is the thing that's going to, you know, be the difference between companies that innovate well and take advantage of the opportunities that technology provides us and those companies that don't. As a kind of surrogate for some of their innovation projects. And one thing that Andy, the CEO, or the former CEO up until a few weeks ago, he said one of the things that we set ourselves up to do for Heineken here in New Zealand is to be an incubator market, a place where Heineken can have a go, can test different products and concepts, and we've got one of the highest innovation rates across the Heineken world. We aim to be very, very rapid with our innovation. And Andy's just been promoted to a big role in the Heineken group now. But you know, he would say, you know, Heineken, if you look at Heineken opcos in other markets, they're enormous. They're like, compared with DB in New Zealand, they're much, much, much bigger. And even though DB Breweries is a big company by New Zealand standards, in the world it's a tiny little company, right? It's like Heineken view us as this little startup, really. And so, because we think of ourselves in that way, we can run really fast. Because we know if someone in a Heineken opco in the States or in Europe would think, if only we were as small as DB Breweries, we could do anything. We'd have no politics. We'd have no blockages in our way. We'd be so fleet-footed. And that's the way that they kind of think of themselves. We have this tendency, though, in New Zealand to think of ourselves as big companies and then forgive ourselves for all the sludge that comes with being a large organisation. You know, but we only have one big company in New Zealand, which is Fonterra. There aren't any other large organisations in New Zealand. We should all think of ourselves not as big companies with the inevitable kind of problems that come with big companies. We should think of ourselves like DB and Heineken do, as small companies that have the potential to run very quickly, to turn on a dime, to eradicate the politics and to get things out the door. I think if we reframe the way that we're thinking about ourselves as larger New Zealand organisations, that potentially we can kind of open up ways to move much more quickly and get much more out the door and really be innovating. So thanks very much. If you've got questions, I'd be really happy to take questions and keep the discussion going.
I get your toothbrush messages every night when I'm reading the paper online. Is it an expensive advertising media for you guys?
Facebook?
No, I get it on Stuff.
Oh yeah, okay.
Every
Well, this
night.
is a real So this is a real doozy. So Fairfax have a product called Pop Shop. So Fairfax actually under Simon Tong, who since left and moved to ASB, but Simon was actually really kind of one of the best CEOs in my opinion in terms of actually driving a kind of culture of innovation and trying new things. And one of the really interesting, I mean, he asked a question early on at Fairfax around how do we monetize our audience in new and more interesting ways. So they invented this thing called Pop Shop. So Pop Shop is, as an advertiser, as a manufacturer or a brand owner, you go to them and you allow them to operate a shop front on stuff for your product. So then they take the payment for the product, they take 18% cut of that, 18% cut of that, and they advertise you on the stuff platform, so you pop up in between, on your feed when you're reading stuff. Now you don't pay anything other than the 18% commission. So so for all of those impressions, and so we're on Stuff's main page like every day, just about. We don't pay anything. We only pay an 18% cut on the product that you buy. So for us, it's really great because we know what the cost of sale is, exactly through Stuff, and we get all of these impressions, all of this brand awareness for nothing. So
How's that audited? How's that audited?
Well, we have to fulfill the product, so we know exactly how many they've sold. Yeah. So they couldn't cheat us on it. Yeah. But we trust them anyway, I think. But yeah, I mean that's a really cool thing for Fairfax to have done, to figure out a new model of monetizing audience. B, it's a super cool product for companies like us, or for anyone who's like launching a startup and wants to go to market and wants to test something out, because that's a very, very cheap way of sort of getting mass scale really quickly. Yeah.
Yeah, James, great presentation, thanks. Just a quick question about culture. You read a lot and hear a lot about innovation culture, and you've been talking about some really practical things around pace and speed. What's your take and on culture and the role it plays? Is it an enabler, a hindrance? Where does it fit?
Yeah, I mean, obviously culture is like critically important. I think the thing for me about culture, I think, is that it's like innovation. It's something that everyone talks about, and everyone has sort of a strategy around, and very few people do it authentically. And they did this. Jim Collins and Jerry Porras did this. They wrote this book called Built to Last, which some of you might have read in the 90s, and they studied a bunch of companies that had outperformed the stock market consistently over a kind of century. These were big global companies, and they went into all of those companies and they dug really deep and they sought to understand what made those companies so consistently successful. And they found that they were companies that had, they basically invented the term BHAG, Big Hairy Audacious Goal, that came from that book. They invented the idea of a values-based organisation, that came from that book. They sort of popularised and made much more lucid the idea of having a really clear vision and of having a core purpose. So their why or their purpose, all of that stuff came out of that like really kind of quite profound and quite seminal kind of piece of research that they did. One of the things, the most interesting thing I think that they found was that when they were talking about values, and values kind of, they popularised this idea of a values-based organisation, and everyone's taken that idea and everyone's got their corporate values. But what they said in the book, if you go back and kind of read what they were actually saying, they didn't say invent a bunch of values. They said understand what your leadership's values actually are, and then hold those dear, right? So now what we've kind of actually come to is like, we have a brainstorm and we go, what would people like our values to be? Or what should our values be? Or what kind of are the right kind of values to have right now? And we put those up, and then we kind of put the posters on the wall and tell everyone that's what our values are and that's what our culture is. The problem with that is, and what they identified in Built to Last, was that when, as soon as a company's leadership demonstrates something that's not on those values, that whole house of cards disappears, right? So everyone goes, oh, well, those aren't really our values, and then they become completely meaningless. And I think this is the thing that about culture and about values is you've got to, your culture has got to be synonymous with your leadership's kind of style and what they actually do and say every day, not kind of something different. And so I think that's kind of, in terms of, if you want to drive a culture of creativity, a culture of innovation, then you have to look to the leadership of the organisation to really live that, not pretend to live it, not think that they should live up to it, but they have to genuinely be kind of doing that and showing that every day. You can only lead by example. You know, the kids will act like the parents. You know, that's just how it goes. And so I think that's what I think about culture. You know, it's very popular, but it's hard to be really authentic. And I think we should be kind of building culture more authentically around what the leaders of the organisation really are about, and not kind of kidding ourselves as much. Hey.
Hi there. I'm Previously Unavailable in New Zealand. I'm just interested to hear around innovation of product and agility, and especially consensus in the larger organisations.
Yeah.
Who do you, in your opinion, are doing it well out of the large guys? If you do.
I hate it when people ask me that question. It's really hard, kind of hardly anyone, you know. It's really tough. So I think there's been isolated examples, and Air New Zealand are one of those. You know, there really has been kind of a really consistent amount of new things that have come out of Air New Zealand, and you could sort of, you could argue that it's more in the sort of customer experience space than it is in the new product space, but I think that's beside the point. You know, they have been very good at sort of identifying customer needs and actually getting stuff out to market in a way that most of our large organisations have struggled. So I think the airline is a really credible kind of example. I think they're still looking for a big success really, but what Spark Ventures managed to do for a few years there in terms of actually kind of carving off and investing in quite a large part of the business, again, to really kind of say, how do we run much faster and how do we actually get things out into the world? I think that was a really good effort, although I think at the moment it's questionable how quite the fruits of that effort at the moment. But I think besides that, what I see at the moment is lots of companies doing incubation teams, little accelerators, venture groups, where they're sort of trying to do a little bit like what Spark attempted, but the real investment in it, it feels a little bit like culture again. It feels a little bit like, hey, that's what we should be doing, and we're investing in starting the process. Hey, you group, go away. Why don't you start to think about something? And if you come back to us with something good enough, then we might back it. Rather than doing what I was talking about before, which is saying we are going to be in market on this date with something. We don't know what it is yet. That's okay, but we're definitely not going to miss that goal. So make something and get it out. I think there's still too little of that. So I think there's sometimes probably quite an authentic attempt to say, create a different culture and do a different thing, but really the antibodies around that are still pretty kind of fierce ones. So I think, it is really hard. I think we are really struggling. If you look at the amount of stuff that's come out of our large corporates over the last kind of 2 or 3 years, we certainly have not been prolific. And there are exceptions to that, but I think we need to do better.
Just what I know everyone's got to get back to. My concern is all the companies, well, not all of them, but a lot of them that you listed up there that were innovative, none of them are making money. And the reality is they will end up selling offshore because that's their only way of survival, or listing on the stock exchange. How do we stop that happening and keeping innovation and ownership in New Zealand?
So the company's not making money,
Well,
you mean like the Amazons?
Like My Food Bag was losing $7 million a year in Australia, and
Yep.
Rod Jury listed and had quite he had some tough times in
Sure.
terms of scale.
Yeah.
Lewis Road Creamery, talking about profitability. So
Yeah.
I mean, they're all fantastic, but at the end of
Yeah.
the day, you've got to make money to survive.
Yeah, totally. So I think, well, firstly, I think on the My Food Bag example, I think the Australian side of it, that proved too difficult for them. I don't know the exact commercials around the New Zealand business, but I mean, it's a big business, and from what I heard, there's a margin in it. So I'm not sure that they're an unprofitable business. Lewis Road, I don't know the financials around that. Xero has built an enormous amount of kind of value, and although they're on the same kind of path as so many large tech startups kind of around the world in terms of how do you create a sustainable profit stream out of that. I think that's a challenge that kind of, that's not particular to Xero or particular to kind of companies that are thinking differently or being innovative. So I think, yes, that's always the challenge of any business is how do you grow that into something that's both valuable from a kind of, a stock market performance, but also profitable. I don't think that's at odds with being innovative, though.
I still think we need to recognise that we've got Sandra here from the Comfort Group, those good, solid New Zealand businesses that have stayed in New Zealand, that are continuously, like Sleepyhead, continuously innovating and keeping the money and the leadership in New Zealand.
Yeah.
I think they're amazing companies.
Yeah, totally. I think that's a really important point, right? That now we are actually competing on a global stage. That we're competing with companies like the Facebooks and the Googles of the world, right? Like it or not, they're setting the standard that consumers the expectation level that consumers are expecting right now. So one thing that Barbara from ASB said is that, if you look at the amount of people the amount of time that people spend each week with their bank, and then you look at the amount of time each week that people spend with Apple, Google, Facebook, Uber, and Amazon, it's much, much more in that space. So they're really setting the expectation, not the kind of the other banks and the kind of competitors that we have directly here. And so the need to innovate now is not so much to compete with the other guy down the road, it's to compete with those much larger organisations and live up to the expectations that they've created. And so certainly from a local point of view, there's even more need to be ahead of that curve and be understanding what our customers need in New Zealand faster than those larger companies were. Co-op taxis created an amazing situation for Uber to come into by dint of not really kind of innovating and not really kind of staying ahead of things, as did Sky TV and Netflix. And so, if we don't want to be encroached on by those very fast, very good companies globally, we need to be kind of proactively meeting customer needs right here.
Thank you very much. Sorry.
Go on.
Hi. I thought, the interesting comment about, getting to put in faster and that. Do you think it's a fear of failure or a culture of everyone's too busy, it's easier to say no, or is it a little bit of laziness that, we don't want to add more work to our day, so let's just keep doing our day job and not...
Yeah. I think it's a bit of all three of those things, to be honest. I think that people, so some of the CEOs, when we ask them whose responsibility is innovation, they would say, we think it should be everyone's responsibility, because that's the fashionable thing to say right now. The reality is that although some of us are interested in innovation, frankly, the vast majority aren't. They come to work to do a job, they're not really interested about where the world's going and kind of how to do a great new thing. They're not really interested in that. None of the CEOs, when we asked that question, said, we've given the innovation responsibility to the people who are most passionate about innovation. And I thought that was really telling, right? If you want to make innovation happen, find the people that are really passionate about it and really good at it and give it to them. Innovation, like anything, some people make great salespeople and some people make shit salespeople. Some people make great accountants and some people make terrible accountants, right? That's fine. And some people make great innovators and some people make terrible innovators, and we need to kind of weed out who the ones are that are really passionate and really into it and are going to go the extra mile to do that really hard thing of getting the thing out the fucking door and over all of those barriers, right? We've got to identify who those people are and give the responsibility to them. But also to your point about risk aversion, I think one of the bits of advice that I give people around risk is make sure you understand the worst case scenario, because usually when I ask people, have you understood the worst case scenario? They say, no, we haven't. And what they do is they think about what could go wrong in a kind of blurry way in their heads. They think if something goes wrong, something terrible is going to happen. So we can't let anything go wrong. When you get to sit down and write down exactly what is the worst case scenario, is that bad? How fast would you recover from that? They usually find actually the worst case scenario is way better than they had sort of their fear was in their mind. And so that's one thing that we have to do, is to kind of go with a new idea, figure out what's the worst case scenario, what's the worst thing that could happen. In the case of something like toothbrush, for example, the worst case scenario is we lose $15,000. That's not a big deal, right? And I understand that that's a lot easier than being in a large organisation where you've got reputation, brand reputation, all that kind of stuff to protect. But also, how do you recover from stuff? When Air New Zealand, back to Air New Zealand, when they there was a time when the meals were taken off the trip to Australia in business class. I think they stopped doing meals, and then they turned that round, and Rob Fife at the time made a virtue out of it, saying we've listened to our customers and we've brought the meals back. And you know, and the market went, oh look, aren't they fantastic? They listen to their customers. And you know, so sometimes actually, even the worst case scenario, you go, we could recover from that by twisting it in this way, or we could make up for that, and we'll actually come out looking even better because we tried something that didn't work and we listened.
Steve, when they tried to pull Monteith's out of South Island, did exactly the same thing. And
Yeah.
do a U-turn on it.
Yeah, you turn it and put it back, and so you can kind of, you know, you can come out looking like the hero if you, when things don't go your way. So I think that's kind of, you know, that's my advice on risk.
Thank you.
I'm not quite sure I'm going to say now, but look, thank you very, very much. It's a great presentation. I absolutely thoroughly enjoyed it. We're all going to go home and think about hurdles and speeds to market, and you've been really insightful. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.